demographics.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. That's the first time I've ever been cheered at a hearing. It's my last one, I hope, unless we're back here on Tuesday. I assume that means the speakers come on. Okay, great. Good. Ms. Dorr, I'm just going to take one more point from the council, and then we're going to go on to the employment needs.
Thank you, sir. I think it's I don't want to go over old ground, but we sort of seem to be talking about a policy on and policy off position, and Horsham have come into some criticism about not delivering housing, and we did discuss this, and it was in our matter statement, HDC 05, when we discussed on the housing day. Horsham, remind the inspector that Horsham is a local authority that adopted a core strategy in 2007. We were the third local authority in the country to do this. Every local authority has fallen behind in their housing delivery, and I do commend Mr Stevens from the House Builders Federation with chasing local authorities up to try to make sure that they meet their housing targets. But Horsham has responded to that. We have had a plan in place, and we did introduce the Facilitating Appropriate Development supplementary planning document in order to try to catch up with our 5-year housing land supply. I acknowledge that we did get behind with that, but we are a 5% authority. We're not an underperforming authority. And the fact that we're here at the plan, putting our plan at the moment, which meets our own needs and meets the needs of others, I think shows that we are trying to meet the needs of others. We do have a lot, when we get on to the trajectory later, perhaps you look at the detail, we do have a large handful of, a bag full of sites from developers with planning permission that is in our supply. There's approximately 3,800 sites that are already in hand, so we're waiting for those to be delivered. So I think, you know, in terms of just summing that up, I thought that might be helpful to go back to where we were a while ago.
Yeah, okay. Mr Stevens, your board was up. Was it in relation to any of this, or did you want to move on to employment?
It was, if you don't mind, I just wanted to tackle a couple of the points that came up, I think was raised specifically by the CPRE, which is the citation of the recession as an excuse, really, for why the past delivery rates have been distorted. The government does recognise that, but it doesn't allow that to intrude upon what should be the objective assessment of need. And the PPG does actually say specifically that you shouldn't take into account past rates of delivery, but you should take into account past rates of delivery, under delivery, as you know, taking into account the effect of the recession, where you might need to make an upward adjustment to the overall housing numbers. On the matter of...
Yeah, but Ms Dawes just, I mean, that doesn't apply to, that's the 20% uplift, isn't it, you mean, that you're talking about there? And Horsham is not recognised as a 20% authority.
It goes back to the debate that we had about whether you should be slavishly following the trend projections, the demographic projections, and what sort of adjustments upwards you need to make to account for suppression of headship rates and market signals.
Oh, right, okay, we're going. But then, well, I think, yes, so one would... So
the effect of recession...
I think one would, the ideal that one would try, and I think most inspectors would try to do this, is to try and even that out. Is that the point you're making? You know,
yeah.
that you...
Yeah. The effect of the recession is something that you need to take into account. It isn't a justification for you to just
so you try and take into account a period that goes back beyond the recession as well, and try and balance it out.
Yeah. On the question of local needs, I think we need to be very clear about this. The local needs, if you're meeting local needs alone, you're really talking about the zero net migration figure, which is not accepted as being an appropriate starting point, for good reasons, because the council, one, can't decide who lives in Horsham, and nor should it, and the fact that it can't stop migration, which is Mr Boyle's point. So zero net migration, just catering for what the natural growth of the indigenous population, is not an appropriate starting point, and the PPG is very clear about that.
Well, I don't think anyone's saying it is, but I mean, it's just what we're talking about, that figure is actually very much lower than the figure that is being provided for. So it's relative degrees of in-migration and how much this. So that leads actually very neatly on to. I mean, we've covered some of this ground anyway, and I'm going to bash on. I'll try and take a short break, maybe in 20 minutes or so. Pardon? Oh.
Thank you. So could I just make actually two very short points in response to points from the other side before we forget them? Number one, something which comes up in every examination that someone just said on the other side is it's odd that the only people who question the figures are people who have a financial interest in doing so.
Well, okay, I don't need you to respond
I have
to
an
that.
important point here, I think, which is a factual point. Why do developers have a financial interest in building houses in Horsham? Because people want and need to live in Horsham. They can get a job and it's a nice place
Well, they
to
want
live.
to. Yeah.
And this is what generates those evil profits that we all, live so fatly on. So the market is trying to tell you something, and the NPPF says that you should be listening to what it's trying to tell you. So actually, it is a serious point. A second, maybe less controversial point, the Council has pointed out that they've been trying to repair their underperformance. And this no doubt is true. But I think the point that both Mr. Boyle and I made about under-delivery is that the past under-delivery is what it is and is built into the demographic projections. You can change things going forward, but you can't change history. And it's that history which the projections roll forward. And the PPG says, if that is the case, you must make an adjustment. Thank you.
Well, that's something for you to come back to that later. Let's move on to the employment position. I mean, it does lead into this. I mean, we're the council want to respond to that, to kick this off in terms of employment growth, and because it's all related, really. The past performance is allegedly you haven't provided enough housing land for what the market would ideally like. And it's quite clear from some of the figures that we've had put forward and some of the sites being put forward, the developers are saying, we want to build more houses. We don't want to build 650 a year. We don't want to build 750 a year. We don't want to build 800 a year. We want to build 1,000 a year, 1,100 a year. I don't know what's the top figure. The council did produce a summary document of this, which you should have all have seen. I mean, I allowed it. It was just factual information, but of where people were coming from with regard to the housing numbers. Has it got a number on it? Is it 43 or something? Anyway. 42. Barton Millwall 1,000 or 1,059. So it's really in the past you've had a target figure. I mean the new target figure from the CLG and as adjusted through this process should reflect the need, including any reflection of past performance, as Ms. Dawes just said. But what's your general point about this and the need to provide yet even more housing to basically produce increased employment as well?
If I just go back to my point that we have in total with our allocated sites and our planning permissions, we have 7,000 housing units with planning permission in the year 2011-2012, and our trajectory in our position statement HDC 40, as you can see, 261 units were only delivered in that year, yet we had all those permissions. Our trajectory does go forward and it picks it up. We have revised our plan, done viability assessments, sustainability appraisal, and we've looked at our affordable housing. We believe that there is a balance and it's NPPF compliant, our plan, so there's no reason why those sites can't come forward. Those sites have permission, they've been tested. So as far as we're concerned, we don't think that the market could supply any more than those. We have extant permissions at the moment and allocated sites that we're taking forward that we believe are viable and deliverable.
Okay, what about anything you want to say about employment, or shall we take some comments? Would you like to set out the council's position first, and then I'd like that to be tested, please, by the people who've raised comments on it.
Okay, so just in terms of that I've carried out, back to that report, which have a CDH 03 or H03, I don't know if it's a 0. Which we've dealt with economic driven projections in section 3 from page 27. And the core projection run links back to a job growth figure of 275 per annum, which I believe came from your earlier.
Well, that was a figure that I referred to as what the job growth appeared to have been. I mean, I think that's been disputed by someone as well.
Yes.
But as what I thought the past, going back some way, trying to average out recessionary trends, the past job rate growth rate have been.
Yes. So we've tested that. Taken account of commuting patterns, double jobbing, the fact that some people hold down more than one job, and also looked at likely changes to employment rates. And the changes to employment rates are based on an understanding of what national forecasters such as Cambridge Econometrics, Oxford Economics and Experian expect to happen with employment rates. And in doing that, flicking all the way over to page 31, suggested that that level of job growth, the level of housing coming out of the demographic projections, they're virtually identical. So the suggestion was that certainly that level of jobs growth would see a sufficient increase in the local labour force.
Yeah, right. But well, there's a question about, you know, the baseline. The baseline figure. Now we've got an increased. My concerns were that I knew that taking into account the North Horsham allocation and the business park, and I know some people think that that isn't viable and might not ever happen, but assuming that it did, that would generate some job growth. That seemed to me to be the only major allocation. We've seen some job losses actually in the town centre. I don't know what's happened to public sector employment, but I mean the council itself is an illustration of, you know, it's vacated an employment site which has been converted into housing. And as far as I'm aware, there aren't any. There are some vacant. There are a couple of vacant sites, or sites that were allocated. There's a brickwork site, isn't there, in North Horsham that has never been developed, which we talked about before, but that's, I suppose, a potential site. So my concern was, where's this employment going to come from? Retail employment we've discussed, and that, okay, there's some consolidation and potential increase in the town centre. I gather John Lewis are starting is opened or something, is it? Oh, right, I haven't been around since I've been back, but okay. So that's, but you know, your figure did say that I wasn't sure how this was all going to pan out, so I just made, you know, a guess and thought, well, okay, at least there will be growth. I mean, the objectors are saying that there should be an awful lot more growth, and that we should be providing an awful lot more employment growth and housing growth to go with it. to supply it.
Sir, if I may come in at this stage,
Yeah.
Philip James. If we go back to the discussions that took place in November, at that stage the council was proposing an expected job increase of 445, which was set out in the economic growth assessment. There was some discussion, as you recall, on the subject, and there wasn't any suggestion, I don't think, at that stage that we should be looking for substantially more employment provision. And in your preliminary findings, there's no comment suggesting that we should readdress the issue of employment land supply. So we followed the logic that is set out in pages 9 onwards of your interim findings. We've noted the fact that the aspiration of a job increase of 445, which is described as the baseline figure, is a very significant increase based on immediate past trends, and followed the logic that was set out for us in your report. We have now considered that a more realistic figure would be in the order of the 275, and we've then moved on, as you've suggested in your preliminary findings, to look at the impact that figure has, together with others, on the housing target figure. So the council's position is that the 275 is a reasonable figure. There is, in the local area, no increase of employment immediately to be found. It may be in the longer term that there is an increase in interest, particularly after what we hope will be the success of the North Horsham development. It would be unwise, in our view, given what we've heard, and you've heard as well, sir, about the importance of the marketing of that major project in the town. We wouldn't want to be seen to be advancing other major projects until we see how that one works. So in the medium term, if I may describe it like that, so that's beyond the next 5 years, if there's a significant increase in requirements for employment provision, we can adjust to that through the mechanism of the early review of the plan. So I would suggest that we need to concentrate here on the first 5-year period, and for that, the figure that you set out in your document, the 275 figure, seems to us to be a reasonable basis to proceed.
Yeah, but okay. I mean, I put that in as a baseline figure. I mean, based on the past experience and taking into account the allocations that you put forward. I mean, when you had your evidence base that suggested a baseline figure that was much higher, did you think? How did you think that was going to come forward at the time? You're now saying that you don't think that's going to come forward. Jobs at that rate won't come forward.
We don't think that the higher figure, the 445, is at the moment likely to be achievable.
Why?
Because of the situation that the economy is in, and some of the factors that you've described just now in observing the local conditions. And we are making a substantial provision of in North Horsham, which will deal with the immediate priorities for job growth. And actually, as you've set out in your report, taking the immediate past period and projecting that forward doesn't give us 275. It gives us, I think, a figure lower than that. You've actually projected an increase over what has been achieved in.
Okay, I mean, I was.
I'm looking here
I was trying to do the best I could with the information I had at the time. I mean, it's something that I'm happy to come back to. All right, let's take some comments on this. Mr. Macklin.
Thanks, sir. So can I it's important, I talked about this earlier, about looking at the OAN, the objective assessed need, before we look at requirements, local plan requirements. Because, of course, if those requirements don't meet the OAN, then we start talking about unmet need. That applies equally to employment as it does housing. Now that's quite clear in paragraph 4 of 2A of the guidance, which talks about housing and economic development assessments. And it says there that plan makers should not apply constraints to the overall assessment of need, and that equally applies to housing and its own employment. It's at the start of the document, such as limitations imposed by the supply of land for new development. Now, it strikes me here that that is exactly what has been done in trying to balance the past trend figure that was referred to with the future delivery. It's a convenient number that sits with a possible supply, albeit, of course, the future employment allocations are in B-class uses. Now, what we're talking about here is job growth across, as you referred to earlier, you referred to John Lewis, across a wider spectrum of industries. So I think we have to take the supply side element out of the equation here, as you're doing with housing, in looking at that later, and just focus on the likely level of job growth that's going to occur. Now, I agree with your point earlier that the forecasts are volatile. They do differ, quarter on quarter on quarter. But what we've seen is a consistent pattern of higher levels of job growth reported, exceeding that baseline figure of 445, which was presented in the Economic Growth Assessment of April 14. Now, that is the only evidence base that's been prepared which sets out in an OAN sort of unconstrained method the forecast, and you'll remember it not only set out the baseline, but it set out further high-level scenarios as well across the housing market area. And we've got to consider that housing market area, because any adjustments we make to labour force provision here, if we dumb down the number, will impact on the flow of labour out to those surrounding authorities of Crawley and Mid-Sussex and beyond. And we're just not focusing on that at the moment. Now, just going back to the forecasts, as I say, the baseline referred to a figure of 445. Experian, the same source of that forecast in September 14 was referring to 662 jobs per annum. Then it went up to 803, then 786 in March, and then just recently in June, 735. But
so I haven't seen the background of these figures. I did look, but you have to subscribe, and they're not in the council's report. I mean, are they just projections? How do they derive these at the Horsham level?
They're trend-based. They are trend-based projections. So they look at the presence of industries.
What, national trend-based?
They will look at past trends at a local authority level, and they will apply the growth by industry that's occurring at a national level to the presence of employment at a local level. So there's a trend element in these projections. The issue of just going back and looking at past trends and saying, well, the past trends were 275, we'll extrapolate that forward, is that inherent within that are some industries that have declined. So if I can give you an example, and we've actually obtained some longer-term trends from Oxford Economics, which actually show between 2001 and 2011, job growth averaged at 391 per annum. So over a longer period of time, the job growth was greater. But inherent within that was, for example, the financial and services industry. Now, that declined over that period of time by 2,900 jobs. There is only 1,811 jobs reported in 2011 in that sector. So you cannot just apply that average forward, because to do so would be to take down that industry's job provision below what is possible. So it's not as simple as just applying past job growth trends. We know, however, that the longer-term trends are greater than 275, and I believe that NLP have also, in their evidence, confirmed that Experian have actually subsequently revised that shorter-term trend upwards above 275, I think, to 340. We also know that the more recent Experian forecasts are far higher than the baseline. And we know as well, we've obtained some forecasts from Oxford Economics, which also confirm job growth in the future of about 630. So all of this new evidence put together confirms that a figure of 275 is constrained. And the only evidence available across the housing market area is that economic growth assessment of April 14. And we would certainly look for you to sort of plan on that basis.
Which companies have said they're coming?
Well, hang on a minute. Yeah.
As I say,
I'll take, it's for me to ask questions like that. and
This
other
is,
people.
but it's important here to recognise.
Well, look, I'm sorry. If you're not a participant, I can't have people shouting out. Well, you can't do that either. I'm sorry. I'll deal with it in time. That's what it was one of my points I've already made to you, but I'm going to take some other comments on this. You know, that's why I asked the question about where do these projections come from and what sectors are they, and we know what the plan provides for in terms of a major business allocation. Mr. Boyle, you wanted to comment on this. Someone turn off, please.
Thank you, sir. Yes. Firstly, I'd support the proposition that when looking at the job growth, it certainly shouldn't be constrained by, as it were, turning off the taps of the land supply on employment. And that's plainly not the right way of approaching the job forecasts and hence the OEN arising therefrom. It would be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the job growth that has been used within the Justin Gardner report is the 275, contrary to the earlier and higher figures. The consequence of that, sir, is that the turnout of the figures for the employment assessment is, I think, one different from the demographics. It's 614 rather than 615. And there is, if I can put it this way, a rather nice and easy sense check for that, because the figures you find at page 29 of the report, paragraph 314.
Yeah.
There's the mathematics in the middle there, 314, using the 275 and adjusting it, you get to 307, which is then rounded to 310 over the page. And by mathematics not set out in the paper, that turns into 614 jobs. So, forgive me, 614 houses to be built. The 275 over the 20 years is a little over, well, it's 5,500 jobs over the 20-year period. And if you remember, sir, what we touched on a little while earlier, at page 21, the population is due to decline between the ages 30 and 60 in the order of about 3,000 people. So the way in which the demographics and the jobs work seem to be in two different directions. The demographics at 615 has a net absolute decline of 3,000 people within that important bracket, 30 to 60. And yet the mathematics that lead to 614 on the employment is supposed to support an additional 5,500 jobs. So it's tricky to see how, just at first blush, you can lose 3,000 people within that bracket but get 5,000 jobs going. Now, you then look at the fact that the increase in age, the increase in the age group 15 to 29 is only 105. So given that starts at the age of 15, there's not much in the way of additional workers in that bracket, 105. So it's all principally, I mean, to a very, very large degree, to be drawn out of the 60 to 74 bracket. So these 5,000
People
jobs,
like me working longer than they should,
I
Mr.
fear
Boyle,
so.
you know.
All of us. It's the grey workforce. But that's just an easy way of checking that there's something badly wrong with these figures.
Well, yes, because they don't. I mean, that goes against your case, doesn't it? In a way, that if you know we're providing more jobs than there are going to be residents to fill them.
No, it goes directly in favour of our case, which is you need to provide more houses to provide more people in the bracket.
Oh, what
30,
for the jobs?
30 to 60 to meet the jobs.
Or
If
there is, well, okay.
But that's the point we're on now. That if we're looking at an
How does that? Okay.
Forgive me,
Let's-
an employment-led assessment to see what adjustment we might need to make in order to achieve the 5,000 jobs.
But
if it's 5,000,
where do you stop
we need
then?
more houses.
Is it? I mean, is it a complete policy off?
Well, we're looking to see.
Well, supposing we said, okay, let's have, I don't know, let's have 500 a year new jobs.
Well, that's,
600 a year new jobs.
that's the point we now come
So
to.
you would then say, okay, that's good. That's positive planning for employment. I mean, I'd say to the council, where are they going to go? As the gentleman at the back shouted out, what sectors are these jobs going to be in? Where is it coming from? We know we've got a business park, but that's all we've got in terms of new jobs, new sites for jobs. I mean, they're not all going to be, teenagers developing apps in their bedrooms, are they? They might be other, and there's some, but the retail, retail employment, okay, there might be more jobs, but whether they're actually in terms of full-time equivalents anymore with the change in online and patterns there in terms of employment, where's that all going to come from? And so therefore, do we then say, okay, we need 1,000 dwellings to provide for a lot of employment and growth?
Well, that's precisely
That's what you want.
That's precisely it. The job figures of even sticking at 275, that's 5,000 jobs. So the annual figure they've used, 275, doesn't match what happens demographically in terms of holding the housing just at 615, 614. That's the first point. Second,
well, that probably comes. Okay, I've got that, and I'll ask the council to go. Because there was a correlation in the previous EGA report of March 2014, I think, which correlated these job numbers to housing numbers. But okay, that's point one.
So
I'd like the council to.
The second point is, of
respond to.
course, the 275, as we've just seen reference to. Experian are now setting out 340. NLP using a mid-range of 440. You can see how sensitive the figures are. If that 275 becomes 340 rather than 440, the 307 rapidly goes upwards, and the consequence in mathematics to the 615 no longer works. And so you've seen the NLP reps that went in with our representations to this session. On the basis of a 440 jobs per annum, which is only the midpoint of the economic forecasts, you're looking at 763 houses required for that economic projection alone.
Okay, Mr. Gardner or Mr. James, whoever's going to. Yeah, come back.
I think I just want to deal with this issue about the overlap between demographics and job growth. As mentioned before, within the modelling there are assumptions which are based on national forecasting houses' views about how employment rates will change, and that particularly does see people working longer, partly as a result of pension age changes, but I think generally as a result of perhaps lack of pension provision, but also increased female participation in the workforce, which has been a trend that's been seen over many years. So those are in there. So whilst we're being highlighted that there's a relative lack of growth or even a loss of people in traditional key working age groups, that does not mean that the labour force will not increase. I think it seemed that the work that I've done for Horsham is somehow criticised in that you can't have that demographic change and that growth in jobs. I think it's worth highlighting that Mr. Ball's with NLP, and he's highlighted that they've looked at 440 jobs and suggested that that would be 760 homes. As part of the NLP, working for the other side, work in April 2015, we provided a labour force output linked to 750 homes so that they could see what impact that would have on employment land needs. And you can bring it up or not, but I've got it as table 2.1, page 5, shows the expected.
Sorry, which document?
Sorry, I don't know what. CDEN 08.
Right, this is the NLP report
Yes.
for the growth, the updated April 13. Yeah. What's this document number?
CD/EN/08.
EM8. Yeah. Page.
Well, I'm at page 5, table 2.1.
Oh yeah.
This was just to cover off the point as to whether
Yes.
we've done something with our employment rates that's unrealistic. So at dwelling provision of 750 homes, there'd be a workplace labour supply increase of 426. If we add on our factor about double jobbing, which was about 5.5%, that would give you jobs of 451. So in effect, we're saying that if job growth was 451, that would equate to 750 homes. NLP is saying 440 jobs is 763. So whatever we've done is pretty much the same as NLP have done. Not exactly the same, but it's coming out with the same output. Just to really cover off that, I think that's a bit of a non-point.
Okay.
I suppose just perhaps highlight that,
We'll come.
yeah, obviously although we say the objective assessment of need is 636, with the council planning at 750, that would generate additional population growth and additional labour supply.
Be very careful,
Well-
sir, of that last observation. Perhaps you were about to be already.
I was.
Good, because that obviously is a dud point, but we can come back to that.
Well, yeah, there's the issue of, if that's meeting needs in Horsham, what about needs elsewhere? And but we need to come on to the housing market area and the employment market area as well. But I'm going to take some other points before I have a break. Mr. Shutt, I know you would be keen to talk about this.
Thank you, sir. I have a number of points to raise, really, and I think the main point I want to say is in respect of the numbers, the historic numbers you quote of 273 or 275 a year. That relates to a period which is mainly before the recession. So, if anything, it would be optimistic, highly optimistic, to project anything much higher than that for the immediate future. People take a different view about economic growth, but it would be very unwise to assume that there's going to be any mass acceleration beyond that rate based on the historical data. I'd also, on a related point, I noticed Mr. Gardner, as it for speaking for the council, suggested that they wouldn't want to allocate any more sites unless and until they, as it were, test marketed the business park, proposed business park for North Horsham. Well, I have to say that's a very odd way of approaching your planning of employment, because you're assuming that actually that will be built, and will, when in fact there's no reason for assuming it will be considered viable enough for anyone to invest in. We went into this exhaustively the last time in November. At that time, the ladies and gentlemen on my left, or the equivalent position, were full of shouts of Manor Royal is full. We must have more business parks, more business space. Well, can I say that just this very week, the Crawley News has reported that they've had to resort to the level of banning conversions of space on Manor Royal to housing, because they consider there won't be enough left. Now, there won't be enough employment land left.
So they have as Horsham does, a protection of some employment sites.
Well, indeed it does, but the point is, the obvious point I'm making is they're going against the market in this case, and they tend to normally believe that. Can I finally add the point?
I've made a note, yeah.
Finally add the point that which I referred to earlier, is the fact that the university campus site, which was put forward in one of the main modifications, and that is now lapsed, that was, according to most reports I read, although I don't think it's in the main modification itself, supposed to generate up to 2,500 jobs. Well, we're lacking that now. So people who are arguing they're going to be several.
Well, we don't know what might happen to that. Does anyone, just for my information, how many people did Novartis employ? Anyone know? Can you remind me? Before they left.
So it was just over 1,000.
Thank you.
Anyway, I think that's it for me for the moment.
Okay, thank you. I think the gentleman from Liberty's here. Is it Mr. James, is it? Oh, sorry, Blevins. Oh, sorry, well, who's the gentleman? Oh, Mr. Dancer, sorry. Yeah, Mr. Dancer, you wanted to speak.
Thank you, sir. Oh, gosh, that is loud. I've got the wrong microphone here. I think I would like to just return to a point that was made by our colleague representing Mayfield Market Towns, which is the assertion that the council has in some way constrained economic development in the district by restricting housing land. I think that is an argument that I find absolutely not to hold water for a number of reasons. Much as his statement was dressed up in statistics, those were all national interpolations to the Horsham district rather than a grounded analysis done by the local district council. Furthermore, as those of you who know anything about public service will be aware of, it's a council's duty and indeed council's drive to encourage economic development. So I can see no reason whatsoever why a district council would want to constrain economic development in that way. It seems to be a convenient argument to push up the housing numbers. And I think, as Mr. Shutt has said, you know, those numbers of 275 are probably even optimistic as we speak today.
Okay, Mr. Mr. Moore.
Yes, thank you. My problem immediately before this resumed inquiry was trying to understand a lot of confusing numbers. And you made the point early on when you said, for example, which are the right housing trajectory numbers to look at. I think the problem we have here is that we don't have a simple summary which shows precisely what we think we're going to achieve with one proposal. And I started with, for example, the simple proposal, let's assume there are 15,000 new homes built in the next 20 years. And I use the figures in the G.L. Horsham report, which look at where people work, who live in Horsham, and you know, one's always taken by surprise when you see the huge number of out-commuters from Horsham. In 2011, for example, it was shown as just under 27,000 out-commuters coming from Horsham district, going out the... And I think what you have to do here is you have to take some simple numbers, first of all, and not get too bogged down with everything else, and look at where the employment, how the employment dynamics currently work, project them forward, and then produce some numbers. For example, if you take the addition of the 2,000 new homes in the Horsham district to the original proposals, are they all meant to be, as it would suggest, people that are going to out-commute to Crawley? Because, of course, that would have a significant effect on what the perceived employment needs in the Horsham district itself were.
Well, yes. We're talking about unmet needs elsewhere in a minute. Okay, Mr. Arthur, and then I will come back to you, Mr. Mackland. Okay, I've seen you.
Thank you. I think there's one or two fundamental questions that still have not been asked. I have no doubt, sir, you will be asking them. If you look at the evidence, we know, as somebody indicated earlier, large companies are moving away from Horsham, and I think there are only about 15 large companies left now. The remainder are SMEs. The evidence that we need to be able to determine the relationship between employment and a housing need clearly depends on the type of business. We know, for example, that Gatwick Diamond, local strategic statement, indicated little need for more business space in the area as a whole, other than for warehousing and distribution. Clearly, people in that type of industry don't earn as much. The chances are they can't afford to live in Horsham district. So what we need to see is a link between the number of jobs, their salaries, and the demand for housing, and that has not been demonstrated. We know, for example, looking around Horsham, we know that in Crawley, the average house prices and salaries the ratio is such that something like a ratio of 8 to 1, compared with about 13 to 1 in Horsham. So guess what? The people from Crawley will most likely commute to Horsham. They won't be buying houses in Horsham. So I think we need some fundamental information to back up the figures that seem to be have developed on an arbitrary basis.
Okay, Mr. Macklin.
I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, to be honest. I think what we're seeing here is a convenience in the council jumping on a figure of 275, because I think they believed that was the figure you were directing them towards. We've seen no evidence since the publication of your interim report, sir, which justifies that on behalf of the council. As I say, I think it was their understanding that that was a figure that they should progress with. I think if I can just direct you in terms of the demand side of things, this was an issue that was discussed at the previous hearing session. And if I could just refer you to, I'm not going to go through this, but just if you could review this. This is Mayfield's representations in June 2014. It was Technical Document 3, Economic Growth, Section 6. And this was the property agent's view on the Horsham offer. And this was an exercise undertaken by Vale Williams, who basically said the demand was there, the supply wasn't. And then that was supported by the chief executive of the Gatwick Diamond Initiative, who has also highlighted the same issue. The demand is there, but there just isn't the supply of sites. Now, of course, what I have been trying to, what I'm trying to do here, sir, is follow the government's planning policy guidance, which, as I said earlier, isn't about supply at this point in time. It is about establishing, in an unconstrained way, the extent of need for housing, and then and separately employment, and then looking to see the balance there. And in that respect, I do refer to the forecast. These forecasts produced by the likes of Experian and Oxford Economics, who do this all the time. They are the technical experts. We can't just rubbish their numbers just because we don't like them. Now, in table 6.3 of my April 2015 technical report, I set out the growth by industry from the Oxford Economics report. So this might assist you, sir, in trying to understand the makeup of that growth.
Yeah, I've read it.
Yeah. Now, we can provide you with more information if it assists. But as I say, what we're missing here is any evidence from the council as to why they now opt for 275. And of course, the other thing we should be doing is looking at that across the housing market area. We know, for example, that Crawley took the baseline figure of the EGA and then increased that with more up-to-date Experian forecasts. So there is this sort of discrepancy in the way that each of these authorities are working across this housing market area, which is having an impact on the availability of labour force.
Yes, okay. Yeah, Ms. Howick.
Thank you,
and then
sir.
I'm going to take a couple. I'm only going to take one more, actually, and then a council response, and then we're going to break and come back for the minute's silence because it's we've run on. So we'll do it that way. Thanks.
So I think we're spending a lot of time on jobs in Horsham, but jobs in the Gatwick Diamond more widely are much more important. And I'm not talking here about the needs of other places. I'm talking about the needs for labour in Horsham, which is Horsham's need, to support growth in the wider HMA and functional economic area. And all the calculations we've ever seen from the council relate to jobs in Horsham alone. Sometimes there's a passing mention of, providing some growth in the Gatwick Diamond, but there's never any hard numbers on it. There haven't been for years. And this is a big gap because the Gatwick Diamond is an area of big economic opportunity, and it's quite clear from the MPPF and PPG that we must plan for the economy on the basis of economic market areas, which are similar to housing market areas, and the council really doesn't seem worried about that. Thank you.
Okay, the council would like to respond to that, and okay, Liberty Trust, Mr. Levins, is it? Yeah. And then the council, and then I'm going to stop.
Thank you, sir. Just to perhaps supplement the intellectual debate with the view of somebody that's on the ground developing, owning and managing office property. Firstly, our enthusiasm for the business park at North Horsham is unstinted. Since we last met, we've been the beneficiary of a phenomenal economic rebound. On all our products, lettings are ahead of schedule. And if I could just come back to a point made earlier about the comments about Crawley. Crawley is full, and demand for space in Crawley is growing, which is why there is a push to resist conversions. So just from our perspective as the organisations that's going to deliver the business park, I can sense a real uptick in demand and a real growing enthusiasm in the wider economy for that project. Thank you.
Can I just quickly ask where his office is, please?
Well, were you
my office is in Kent.
Your Kent property or your... well, okay. But,
which is about 40 minutes away.
But you're not saying anything different to what you said last time, except that you're even more confident. You were very confident last time about your business park proposal.
Even more so now.
Are you saying you're the same or more? Right.
More so.
Okay, Mr. Gardner, or is it Mr. James? And then I'm going to stop.
Thank you, sir. Yes, it's an interesting debate, but of course there is methodologically quite a difference between the approach towards understanding employment need and understanding housing need. This is quite clear in the government's guidance. The government has asked that decision takers, local planning authorities and so on make use of available national statistics, latest national statistics. The government does not publish statistics that we can use here to help us with the employment position. And what we have observed is that there's a wide range of future employment forecasts and that they are volatile. And it is very dependent on the time period that's chosen as to where one ends up at the end. And the summary sheet which you mentioned previously does show quite a wide variation between. But the conclusion that one can draw from this is that there's no evidence that Horsham has been restricting supply of employment land through its economic development function, through its planning function. Every encouragement has been given to employment. Indeed, where in designated employment land has come up for future use, we have encouraged its continued use for employment purposes. And as you are well aware from the previous hearing, we did submit HDC 32, which set out, it was a bundle of various employment matters which had come up at the inquiry, but it included within there a list of sites where we have granted consent for employment. So it's not the case that we're putting all the employment eggs in one basket. All we're saying is that there is justification for one strategic allocation for employment use, which is north of Horsham. It would be, from what we hear, and despite the optimism that's coming from some quarters and the pessimism from others, we think it's wise to concentrate on that one site, but by no means is that the only site. There are sites that are coming forward, which you can see from the list we provided previously. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, thanks everybody. I'm going to take a very short 5-minute break. Could you all please come back here for 1 minute for 12 o'clock, which is in 6 minutes' time, and we'll stand for a minute's silence and then continue.
I make it seconds away from midday, everybody.
Right, I hope everyone's had a chance to take a comfort break. We're going to resume on employment. I've just held a couple of conversations that have been witnessed by people. By this gentleman here, I was Mr. Lowe. I've met before, and we were just. I was just saying how he was. He didn't know that I'd given my notice in and that this was going to be my last case. So, but that was overheard. There was nothing about the merits of the case, as was not. I was talking procedural matters with Dr. Richardson. Following on some correspondence that he'd had with the programme officer and the council. We're going to continue. I'm desperately hoping we can get through this today, and there is a lot to do, but I think we're getting there. I'm going to try and deal with question 1, which is clearly an important one, by lunchtime at about 1 o'clock. And a lot of points have already been made. We were talking about employment growth. Now, there are a couple more boards up. As Mr. Rhodes has come to the table, I've seen, and I think actually, Ms. Mays, you had a board up. But do you want to make a comment about the employment
yes,
implications
please,
for housing growth?
Yes, please, sir. And just in terms, not in terms of the.
Perhaps just tell people that I've introduced
John
you.
Rhodes from Quad on behalf of Mayfields.
Yeah.
I've swapped seats with Simon Macklin. Just in terms of the approach, and in particular, so the question which you asked rhetorically, which is what am I meant to do if the employment forecasts push up the housing numbers to 700 or 1,000 or 2,000? What am I meant to do, sir? And with respect to the answer to that is you're meant to find that that is the objectively assessed need. And the only point I wanted to make is I think it's extremely important not to conflate two parts of the local plan making exercise. I'm sorry.
So I think I know what you're going to say, and then of course there are the constraints to be applied to the need in reasonable
with the
planning.
greatest respect, there was a point in your initial findings which certainly took our team by surprise, which was the suggestion that the 275 might be justified, but for instance by reference to the fact that there's only one employment site allocated, and that is to mix two parts of the plan making process. So it's entirely possible. It's entirely possible that you might find, based on the evidence of job growth, and I emphasise evidence of job growth, that the objectively assessed need is much greater than you may think can be accommodated in the district in terms of housing or employment land. But if that's what the evidence is, that then becomes the conclusion for that part of the plan making process. It could be 1,500 homes per annum, whatever it is.
Okay.
But that isn't to say that the plan has to allocate 1,500 homes. As you know, we then look at the second part of the approach set out in the MPPF and the MPPG as to whether there are environmental or other reasons why that can't be accommodated. So the discussion with respect in terms of objectively assessed need and the impact of job growth on objectively assessed need has to be, we've already discussed policy of, but it can't be by reference to constraints on land. It simply can't be by reference to constraints on land, and that would be a fundamental mistake. And just then
I take the point.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Which is why actually the heading in the bullet point 1 is worded the way it is.
Yes, thank you. And just the other part of this that I wanted to say was that in arriving at your view as to what job growth does to objectively assessed housing need, I do again respectfully suggest that we need to base conclusions on the evidence, and the evidence running into the original examination were the Experian forecasts, which were the basis of the EGA. So they were good enough for everybody, including particularly the councils. They were the basis of the EGA. What's happened since are two things in different directions. One is so that you reached a conclusion around 275, and you thought that might be more realistic. And since then, on the one side, what we've seen is that actually the economic forecasts showed that figure to be significantly too low. And I think all of the economic evidence demonstrates that. And what we're left with on the other side are anecdotes about, hasn't this company just closed down, where are people going to work, you know, those sorts of things. But the evidence exists for a reason. And what the council said to you is, well, you should prefer our grounded analysis rather than forecasts. So just to be clear, the evidence before this part of the examination, which is the GL Hearn report and the updated EGA, both start with your figure of 275. They don't undertake a fresh analysis. They both assume that's the starting point. It's written large in both documents. So if the 275 is wrong or is embarrassed by subsequent evidence, then there isn't a grounded analysis that takes you to a different figure, apart from looking at the updated Experian forecasts, which are the basis of the EGA. They've been used by the other authorities. They were used by this authority. But that's where the evidence takes you. And the evidence is going to take you to a much higher level of OAN. But that, as I say, doesn't mean that all has to be provided. That's to be discussed as part of a separate thought process in this examination. So just by way of approach, and I say that because there's a real danger in this of the whole plan process being found unsound if that distinction isn't made.
Okay, does the council want to comment on that?
Our starting point, I can confirm, was the for this second part of the inquiry was to make use of the notes that you provided for us in the initial findings.
Well, Mr. Rhodes has said that's wrong, or that the evidence supports a higher figure. The subsequent evidence supports a higher figure, actually. I mean, that was, you know, based on my thoughts at the time and you know, what the evidence I had about potential job growth. I mean, I think this, yeah, I mean, the other thing is they were initial findings, primarily about housing, but there is. Do you want to make any comment about subsequent evidence that he's referring to?
Well, it's true to say that you do have more evidence on employment forecast because naturally there have been several months since the closing of the hearings in November and moving forward to the point that we are now. But I don't say it, I wouldn't like to think that they substantially changed the position where we were last November. There were other very optimistic forecasts of employment available at that time, including a range of other forecasts that had been included in the original EGA. So I'm not or there may be more evidence in the sense of Experian have produced a further iteration, but I don't feel, on behalf of the council, that they necessarily deflect us from the position that has been set up and rehearsed. And equally, if we are to go away and carry out further work on this, no doubt there will be further iterations of evidence, and so we go on. But what we don't have is a plan which allows us to move forward in order to come to conclusions and to reach the need that we've all identified.
Yes, okay. I mean, just taking Mr. Rhodes' point, and for your information, Mr. Rhodes, I mean, I'm not I suppose the trouble with the initial find, you know, they're shortcut. I try to do them quickly, concisely, dealing with main issues to keep the process going, as I've already said. I mean, and it puts me in a bit of a difficult position, but then you know, that's too bad. I'll have to say what I was thinking. I wasn't just thinking about the business park as a supply side constraint. I mean, that was evidence of a demand issue. I mean, that was contested by Mr. Shutt, just to your right, and others, as to whether that was a realistic proposition or not, and I'm sorry, Mr. Shutt, I came down on the other side to you on that one, in that I thought, from what I'd heard, and from Mr. Levins and other economic evidence from and there was the report that said that quality of space was an issue as well, and that this would provide new quality of space in a different location that would be viable. So I was looking at it as a potential, as an indication of demand as well as and a supply constraint. Now, at the time, I wasn't particularly aware of a lot of other demand other than your proposal, which was a big mixed-use proposal for sites. So, I mean, if anyone's got any other evidence that they want to raise about that now, now's the time, really. But that was part of my thinking about that. I'll come back to you in a minute, Mr. Rhodes. I've got Mr. Dancer and Mr. Sallows wanted to speak on this. Mr. Dancer first, please.
Thank you, sir. As I said, I am a councillor for the district, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the council, nor am I an apologist for the previous forecasting work. But I do think a sense of sort of reason is required here. The Experian forecast, to my knowledge, does not have a Horsham section in it, which is why, as a national guide, it's a very good start, and I'm sure it's founded on extremely good assumptions. But any forecast, as we know, and I think as you alluded to, sir, at the beginning, is only as good as its assumptions. And I'm confident the Experian assumptions do not apply to Horsham. Horsham's a very specific area. It's constrained, not very far to the south by the sea. It has good connections to the south on the A24, has very poor connections to the north on the A24, has appalling connections to the northwest on the A281, as anybody who's ever driven along that road will know. It's also constrained to the east by the Pease Pottage junction to the M23 and A23, which is beyond capacity already, as we know from the last hearings. So whilst I do respect the Experian findings and the erudite people from Oxford economics, I do not believe that it's a sound basis for the Horsham economic number. And as a councillor, I am more inclined to believe those who live, work and base assumptions on the district than Experian in this instance.
Mr. Sallows?
Yeah, I think I'm probably one of the few people around this table who actually works for a modern multinational company. And I think that the important point is that where we are in technology terms at the moment is the use of historic figures now is like trying to use those same arguments at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So I think that certainly the trends in terms of work patterns, and I suspect that the Experian figures can be borne out nationally, but I think where the actual places of work are based will be entirely different. And we've already seen that currently that the bulk of people within Horsham work outside of the district. So there is a migration to workplaces. But what will happen, that won't change in the future. I think what will happen more in the future is that people won't actually have to move to their workplace. So they'll be able to work more and more from home, so that there'll be less of a constraint. So there seems to be a confusion between the employment and an economic requirement for employment against housing. And they're two distinct issues. And the real issue for housing is whether you're providing enough houses for the people that live in the country and in the district specifically on this occasion. And in terms of employment, whether we're meeting the employment needs of the nation to fund the financial growth that we need to go forward. So I think that not necessarily providing a business park in Horsham does not impact on the business, on the employment prospects for people who live in Horsham.
Yes, but the issue is housing supply going to constrain employment growth, I suppose. That's the point.
Provided
That's the
we
point
have
being made by.
Provided we have proper network infrastructure provision and the technology is allowed to grow into those new homes, then that constraint is far less than anything that's been supported so far.
That's your point. Okay, I'm going to start going round. Dr. Smith, you on that side of the table, last person. Do you want to make any? Was it you? Or? Oh, sorry, it's Southwater. Yeah. Mr. Handley.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to check this particular document. I was actually online last night at about 4 o'clock when it was delivered, and I wish it had been issued in draft form because it doesn't accurately represent Keep Southwater Green's position. I made that known instantly at the time, and I was a little disappointed, therefore, to find this morning that the documents that are on the table still don't represent our position.
Okay, well, please correct what you think what your position
Keep
is.
Southwater Green's position is that our calculation of the OAN should be 634. So we only differ from the GL Hearn figure slightly because I believe GL Hearn manipulated their figures right at the start, owing to population projections for 2013. We see no reason to query the work indeed of GL Hearn and others and endorse the 275 figure. And of course that means it's only where we move from the OAN to the actual target that we differ from Horsham District Council. We're saying 705 rather than 750. I don't want to make any particular points on that other than to check that because these figures derive from this report, so that you've actually had it. Have you seen and considered this report?
I'm pretty sure I have. Ms. Dorr, which is that your representations on the main modifications?
Yes,
That's correct. So you have received that, sir.
Yeah, there was some query about a further traffic report. We're going to come on to Southwater itself, and I got one which I had already seen. But I think
this document is a full analysis that takes us through to our figure of 705. So because the figures that I would have hoped to have seen, you know, if this thing had been submitted in draft first of all.
Well, so is this under main modification 12?
4, 10, 11, 12, 13 and 24. Let me hold it up for you.
I think we'll have to check that in lunchtime.
Well, I do hope you have received...
Okay, well, no,
okay.
I'll look at it, I'll check.
Fair enough, thank you.
Rather than going through it all...
My point being that if you haven't seen this, that would explain why our numbers had not appeared in the document that was submitted at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon.
They wouldn't, because I didn't produce this document. That's a Horsham District Council document, this summary document.
Okay,
It didn't come from me.
Well, perhaps we can spend 2 minutes to check
Well,
that you actually have.
I will do, but
Thank you.
anyway, thanks for pointing out what your key concern is.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Many thanks.
Okay, Mr. Perrins, is it you wanted to comment about Mr. James, is it?
Thanks, sir.
Is this about employment implications for housing?
Well, I don't wish to restate some of the points that we made in the original examination, but it's on behalf of Aaron Business Consortium, really just to, I think, emphasise the point that the North of Horsham site, and in terms of the employment allocation within it, it is the sole allocation within the district, and that it won't deliver any new employment land to the district within the first years of the plan. And you obviously heard from the consortium at the original examination that they represent manufacturers and other B-class users who found a significant constraint to supply of new employment or industrial units within the Horsham area. So just to emphasise that point, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Boyle?
So just
speak up a bit, please, Mr. Boyle.
The point on the origin of the evidence for this point. So if you, just for your note, the NLP note that came in with our reps at paragraph 216 reminds us that the 273 that was rounded up 275 was derived from the 2013 Experian forecast. And that has been replaced now, and so it is, by anybody's definition, out of date, and replaced by a different figure from the 2014 forecast, where the job trend is 340. Now, I was referring to a forecast from the Oxford Econometrics scenario of 440, but even if you just stick to the job trend of 340, that is, or would be rather, constrained if you use a 275 figure. 340 is the job trend. And so that job trend is not derived from extrapolation from national matters. The figure 1 derived from Experian on the next page of the NLP work takes actual job changes over a period from 1997 through to 2013. And that's what is the origin of the 340 in terms of jobs. So these are hard figures. These aren't notional figures. And what's particularly notable, perhaps, is that since the depths of the recession, say since 08, 09, in fact, the average that Horsham has been doing is 560 per year. That's what it's been achieving per year by way of jobs, which is, give or take twice what the 615 would deliver by way of workers to fulfill those jobs. And so if you answer the question that you very properly asked a moment ago, the question is, would the 615 constrain jobs? Answer yes, because it's going to give 275 according to the authorities' calculations, whereas in fact jobs should be somewhere north of 340 and maybe 560.
Okay, Mr. Rhodes.
Sir, thank you. Just briefly, and Mr. Boyle said something of what I was going to say, but just to complete and add to that point. So your 275 figure appears to have come from that past trends, 97 to 2013.
Yeah.
And although it's past trends, ironically, it's been revised since the previous hearing, and you obviously couldn't have known that. So if the 275 was right, it would now be 340, just on using exactly the same database and exactly the same time period and exactly the same judgment. But of course, that's an account of past trends. It's not the forecasts.
Yeah.
And the forecasts and the evidence base is the Experian forecast, which informed the EGA. And you recall there were 3 levels of forecast. There was the baseline, and we were only ever talking about the baseline, although it wouldn't be very...
445, wasn't it?
That's right, 445. And the 445 is now, based on information published since we were last sitting down together, is now 735. That information is in Barton Wilmore's appendix to our representations. And I think the important point is that we have an evidence base for local plans for a reason, and the new GL Hearn report and the new EGA are not evidence-based documents in the same way, because they both start from the 275. So the evidence base is the Experian forecasts. And just a couple of points to make around that. One is, well, they're not Horsham specific. Just 2 things to say in response to that. One is what they do, what Mr. Macklin was explaining, is that they take the profile of industries and employment in the Horsham district and apply national trends to that growth. So they're based on the characteristics of Horsham's employment opportunities from its existing business base. And the other point, fairly obvious point to make, is of course that's the whole purpose of the EGA. The EGA is commissioned by these authorities to advise them what should be the solution for Horsham district. And you just can't step away from your evidence base when it doesn't suit you, unless you've got evidence and you haven't heard evidence that is, in my judgment, sufficient to step away from that. And if the reason so was demand, and their evidence is, well, maybe there isn't a demand, so that's a reason to question the growth. You've got, I think, a fair amount of evidence on demand, and Mr. Macklin reminded you of the market evidence that we gave at the last part of this examination. You've also, from Vale Williams, the representations from the Gatwick Diamond. You've also heard from Liberty of the demand they're experiencing already for their business park. You've heard that Crawley is full. In fact, Crawley's not only just full, it's identified an unmet employment need of 35 hectares, which is greater than the North Horsham Business Park, and would swallow it up, meaning that this district isn't providing any new employment land effectively for its own needs. But that's another matter. And then if there was any doubt, what does the MPPF want us to do? MPPF wants us to take a positive approach. We're in the Gatwick Diamond. We're meant to be planning for growth, not planning for constraints. And if there are constraints, the MPPF tells us directly we should be looking to overcome them. So all of which, I think, means that the OAN is substantially larger than the Council has suggested.
Okay, Mr. Shutt, and then the Council, and then we're going to move on to people already made comments about affordable housing need and market signals, but Mr. Shutt.
Once again, sir, I find myself staggered by the lack of economic understanding on the part of the ladies and gentlemen on my left. They seem to think just by creating a space you can actually generate the demand for it. Well, that's a very antiquated economic doctrine. I won't go into called Say's law, and I come back also, I have to Mr. Blevins' comment before we broke, suggesting that the administrative restraint on converting employment space to housing in Manor Royal in Crawley is due to the burgeoning demand for office space. Well, if you've ever heard of market forces, you will know that you wouldn't need to put an administrative restraint on if the demand was really there. And there's plenty of evidence the demand is not there. If I may say, slightly on the other side, and here I'm echoing what Mr. Arthur said earlier, there is some demand, including the primitively developed Burgess Hill hub, not far from here. There is some demand for warehousing and for warehousing and distribution, but the space needed, in relation to the numbers employed, is quite small, or that's to say, it wouldn't generate much in the way of employment. And equally, and again, this is Mr. Arthur's point, I think, that the kind of people who we mainly employed in those on those work sites would not be the kind who could afford housing in Horsham, whether on North Horsham or elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. Do the Council want to respond and make a final response to any of these points?
Sorry, Jeff Smith on behalf of Liberty. Just in relation to timing, and just to underline, again, not repeating anything that was done in November, except to make reference to the evidence that was given then about demand, but to make the point about the phasing of employment and to confirm that Liberty support the Council's policy, SD2, which talks about employment in the first phase of development. And that's something which we have reiterated in paragraph 12.2 of our representations for the hearing last November. It's just for clarification. Thank you.
Okay. Do the Council want to respond to any of the points made, in particular by Mr. Rhodes?
Yes, please, sir, if I may.
And, okay, you can both respond.
I'm sorry, I didn't see the light there.
Just hope you say the same thing.
Well, let's have a go. I'll try and avoid being repetitious. Grateful for the points about methodology, but the hearing process has moved on, we feel. There is evidence of increased demand for employment space, and the local economy in Horsham is now starting to demonstrate more small business activity. As you yourself pointed out, outside of the B1 class there is A1 activity, new retail store of John Lewis and Waitrose. We anticipate that through neighbourhood plans there will be more attention and the potential for site allocations coming forward there. And of course this is our Horsham District Planning Framework is only effectively part one. We will be addressing the issues through the site allocations document. And if there is evidence and support from people wishing to invest in new employment facilities, we will of course take notice of that and make provision. At the strategic level, the local economic partnership has been supportive of our approach. There's no indication, therefore, either from individual employers or developers, industrial estates, or for that matter collectively through the LEP, that there's been any frustration in Horsham District in the provision of new employment facilities or encouragement of these, or indeed the protection of employment land where it's justified. So in our view, it would be prudent to proceed on the basis we have now and make one strategic site allocation at North Horsham, and understand now that with the increased optimism over the progress with that site, that the revised starting date now for new homes and new workplaces is going to be 2017-2018.
Okay, thank you. Some of that's already been said, but what about sort of the implications for this on the housing numbers? Anything else you want to say, Mr. Gardner, and then we move on to the other points?
Okay, I suppose just really wanted to highlight there's been a lot of numbers banded around. Experian now says this and CE say this, which just highlights your point, I think, originally, that economic forecasts vary an awful lot, and the one thing you're sure of is they're wrong. And we've looked at past trend analysis, and we've got NLP saying, well, we'll look back over 16 years, and that's 340. If we look back at a different period over the last 11 years, it's only 150. Last 5 years at 330. Things vary. You know, it's far from exact science, and certainly far less exact than some of the demographic work, where I think there's better quality data comes out that's more consistent over time. But I think the last thing is just to highlight exactly what guidance says on the linking of housing and employment. Not want to read out into detail, but paragraph 18 of PPG ID 2A018 talks about where the working population is less than the projected job growth, this could lead to unsustainable commuting patterns. And in those circumstances, plan makers should consider the locations of housing. So I think there's various tests there. Impact on commuting patterns. Well, we've heard that a lot of people commute out of Horsham, but that could change. But also, it's not so much a matter of an OAN, it's a matter of locations of housing. Because effectively, if you shift more homes into an area, you are effectively increasing your population in that area and reducing population growth in other locations. So it needs to be careful about exactly how this link works. And I guess we'll come back to that when we look at the actual housing figure as opposed to the housing requirement rather than the OAN later on. But I think it's just worth noting PPG, its original draft said you should consider increasing housing numbers, and that's been changed in the final version to talk about the locations of housing.
Okay. Affordable housing need. The original study showed, I'm trying to remember exactly the numbers, I think it was 225 to 400, wasn't it, or something, was the range. Anyone want to make any comments about that? Mr. Boyle?
So thank you very much. So would you mind if you turn to the housing need document, CD HO3, the chill mark analysis is helpfully set out at figure 11 on page 34. And so as you've seen from the reps from NLP, there's one immediate howler.
Okay, sorry. Yep.
There's one immediate howler, which is the use of committed supply when trying to work out what your need is. And given that what we're doing at this stage, and we'll all remember now the Satnam decision, is trying to work out the affordable housing need, supply comes in at the second stage, not at this stage. So NLP have, I hope helpfully, then set out a table of what happens just using these figures if you don't commit that howler. And it's page 13 of their note that went in with the main reps. And so the two different columns we've got here for different household formations, if you don't take into account the committed supply, then you're looking at an affordable housing need per annum of somewhere between 288 and 466, rather than the 225 and the 404. The next point are cautions, two cautions. The first is, so if you look to the row 2.1, these are very correctly gross household formation rates. That's what the guidance says you should use. But for reasons which we have been unable to discern from the Chilmark report, the household formation rates for all ages is less in gross terms per annum than for a segment of all ages, which seems to us counterintuitive. I quite understand that the rate might be higher among certain segments, but if there's a segment versus total, the total should be higher than the segment. And we can't find anything in the Chilmark report to explain that. Normally it may be a straightforward mistake, but I can't help you any further with that. The second caution is in the row below, which is, although it's expressed as proportion of households unable to buy or rent, that 45%, when you get into the Chilmark report, is clearly expressed as unable to rent. So buying's out of the question altogether. And what we can't discern is the extent to which the unable to rent, which is a lower quartile rental against lower quartile earnings, how that reflects the actual need in terms of bedroom numbers, etc., even within the rental market. So it's a caution there. They've used a straight, flat 45% across all factors to then derive either the 449 or the 606. But even with just setting those cautions aside, we get, if you remove the howler, to 288 to 466. The next matter, sir, to bear in mind is that, and we just very quickly alluded to it earlier on, we're at the stage here before taking into account what you might add on for unmet need elsewhere. So it would be entirely misleading to say 750 at 30% is about 225. Anyway, it would need to be about 288. What you have to do is say, well, what uplift are we going to do to this OAN in order to take account of minimum 288, possibly 466, before you then add in the addition for unmet need elsewhere, because of course that brings with it its own affordable housing burden, it being an unmet need from another authority. And there's no suggestion, I don't think, the other authorities are in some way able to meet their affordable housing need but have some extra need on top that needs to be exported. So the next matter is...
well, let's the council deal with those first, I think.
Having not been the author...
Arithmetical error.
I must admit, I don't know about the 699 figures. I was the one that provided the 1049, which is the gross new household formation. I'm wondering if the 699 is in some way linked to overall household growth, but I'm not sure because that figure looks inconsistent as well. But the 1049, I think, is probably the correct one anyway.
That's helpful clarification, but I think somebody needs to deal with that conundrum. It does seem very odd on the figures.
Have we got any way of dealing with that now?
I don't.
Okay, it might even have to be written reps that then maybe, but that's okay. I've made a note of that.
Well, so the easy way of dealing with it is just to look to the second row of figures rather than the first row, where that 1049 comes in, and recognise it's likely to be less than the total because it's only dealing with the cohort 16 to 44. So we're now looking at an annual net need of 404 on these figures, or actually, if you strip out the supply side, 466.
Right. Any comments on that?
In terms of terms of including the committed supply, that is clearly part of guidance that we should be including that as paragraph 26 of PPG. Although I do take the point that in looking at how that overlays with overall housing provision, there is merit in considering it both with and without. In terms of the numbers from the Chilmark report, I think the very high total estimate is probably not correct to use. I think the reasonable preference one, which is in the second to last column, as we've reproduced in the housing needs report, is probably the most realistic. The difference there is, as part of the current need, it's only including those households who have registered for housing and have been determined as having a need by the council. So it's not just everyone that wants an affordable home. And I have no idea, because NLP haven't worked that through, but that presumably is going to be a figure in the early 400s, I would think. A couple of other things.
Yes, okay. Well, then, how does that impact on the OAN then? And then we've got this, people taking different inspectors, even taking different views as to whether you just put that as part of the need, or whether it should add to it in terms of delivery on a 35% basis.
Well, I think there's two
sites.
There's two main things here. One that I know we'll come back on is understanding how the affordable need sits with how the housing market actually operates. And in this case, we're particularly looking at the fact that the private renter sector, through housing benefit, provides housing for a significant number of households. So physical dwellings exist to meet need. I think the second point is, and this particularly comes from the Planning Advisory Service guidance of last year, and we have the author in the room, which notes that quite a chunk of the affordable need is households that already have housing, so it's not an addition to the objective assessment of need. In terms of looking at how that overlays with the OAN, we only need to consider those new households who do not currently have accommodation. So I think as far as the housing needs study is concerned, taking those factors on, we would consider that on balance, there is no need to have any uplift. The OAN is not any higher because of the level of affordable housing need. And I think if we look at guidance, paragraph 29 of PPG, para 2A, talks about local authorities considering increases due to affordable need. So it's not a you will. It's not like the market signals where it says you will need to increase. It is a consider, and I've got no doubt we'll have Eastleigh inspector mention to us. The Eastleigh inspector.
You have already, yeah.
The Eastleigh inspector.
In the reps.
The Eastleigh inspector. Highlighting a particular issue of affordable housing in Eastleigh, which was more severe than the analysis suggests in Horsham, actually said that he did not consider that an increase in delivery of market housing was an objective assessment of need, but was a policy response to that need. And I can dig that quote out, because I have it with me.
Yes, I've seen it.
You've seen that,
Okay.
yes. So I think
I'm aware of it.
in terms of OAN, I don't think the affordable housing need provides any basis for an uplift.
Right, okay. Comments on that, please. Yeah, Mr. Boyle, and then Mr. McLennan, please.
So thank you. As you can see, the numbers are already in the 400s, if we're using the second row, once you take out the supply side. And as we're looking at the OEN, that's what we have to do at this stage. Compared with, if one looks at the demographic, or as the authority puts it, their economic assessment of around 615, at 30%, assuming you get that, you're at 184. If he ups it to 636 with this curious exercise we'll look at, I'm sure, about headship rates, you get 190. That's a long way off even the bottom 225, let alone the corrected figure that I gave you a moment ago. The reliance is then placed on private rented sector, forgive me. The private rented sector, as we are all aware, is not affordable housing as per the MPAPF definition. That was recognised by Mr. Emerson at Eastleigh, but you'll be delighted to hear that it's also been recognised by Mr. Justice Higginbottom today in a case called Odeby and Wigston Borough Council against Secretary of State, which I've just been sent on my BlackBerry. 2015 EWHC 1879 for people's reference, if you look it up. So we've now got High Court authority. The attempt, which I think was first spearheaded by Mr. Gardner, in fact, of using private rented sector in order to mop up affordable housing need, although it's not affordable housing, is not a legitimate approach. And so what, following SATNAM, one has to do is to assess the OAN and then see the extent to which the figure, that's the affordable housing OAN, see the extent to which the unadjusted OAN would meet that, and if it wouldn't, then consider the uplift. And that's not what's happening here at all.
You can come back to that if you want. Anyone else on this point? If you were going to make the same point, don't bother.
I was going to pick up on the Eastleigh inspector's decision, but it sounds like we've got a further, more recent judgment on that. So.
Okay, Mr. Sallows.
I'm slightly confused here that there seems to be two different completely logical points being argued, and I'm not sure of the relationship. One seems to be that there is a need to increase the number of houses because there is an increased need for affordable housing. Whereas I thought the need for housing was down to how many people lived and worked in the area, and the need for affordable housing was what percentage of those can actually afford to buy or rent the homes that are available. So I'm not sure why one impacts on the other directly, only in percentage terms of the having established the overall requirement, then we need to establish what the percentage of that is required for affordable.
Yes, right, Mr. Gardner.
I think that sums
that's
it up
what
quite
your
well.
that's your side's point.
I think that sums it up quite well. Yes. I did just want to pick up because Mr. Boyle is sitting with NLP, who provided the evidence base that say you can't use the private renter sector, and just that's quite an outrageous claim, because I have a report that they prepared in April of last year for High Peak, which has a section, the role of the private renter sector in meeting affordable needs, which does exactly the same thing and says, look, you've got to take account of this. I have a report from NLP, Staffordshire Moorlands from June of last year with exactly the same in it, and also one Blackburn, July of last year. So it's for Mr. Boyle to say this is something that I've concocted is just wrong. It's something that the consultant he's sitting with has also recognised, and I think it has to be recognised because that's how a housing market functions. We could perhaps look at the actual definition of affordable housing in the NPPF, Annex 2.
Yeah.
Annex 2. Affordable housing, social rented, affordable rented, intermediate housing provided to eligible households whose needs are not met by the market. Now, if I'm in Horsham, I've lost my job, I'm on my uppers, I go to the council and say, look, this is my situation, have you got any homes? They say, no, no social rented homes available. Here's a phone number of a private landlord who I call. He says, fine, you can come and live with the housing benefit in my property. In what way is my need not being met by the market? My need is clearly being met by the market.
Because it's being met by the government. That's the point. It's being met by the taxpayer paying the market rent. And that's why private rent sector is excluded from the definition of affordable housing in the NPPF, because it isn't affordable housing.
Well, why would the government have a system set up where housing benefit is payable in the private renter sector if it did not consider that that was a solution? The point is the definition is needs not met by the market, and I'm saying that there's clearly in Horsham there is a sector of the market that meets people's needs, and you can't get away from that. And I think in terms of the definition, if we go right...
I'll look at the court case.
If we go right to the bottom, though, as well...
There's a different issue about, the overall the policy response point as to whether one equates the need to provide affordable housing and therefore one has to inflate the overall need to make it on the basis of the policy that you've got, that you're only going to get 30 or 35% of affordable housing in new housing needs. So therefore on this basis, if you've got 400 a year affordable housing need, one needs 1,000 a year houses because otherwise they won't be provided or they won't be met.
But is that the OAN though? Because then you're opening up the issue.
Well, that's the point that Mr. Sallows. That's the point that Mr. Sallows has made. I think that's a disputed point.
That if you provide the 1,000 homes, you are encouraging greater population growth over and above your trend-based projections, and we're back to the same point that it's effectively saying that there's less housing needed elsewhere. So it's not an objective assessment of need. It's a policy consideration.
Yes, okay, that's the argument on your side.
Well, I just wanted to finish off with the glossary definition. The 5th paragraph, homes that do not meet the above definition of affordable housing, such as low-cost market, may not be considered as affordable housing for planning purposes. And I think that's important, for planning purposes. So effectively the NPPF is saying, look, in providing affordable housing moving forward, we want it to be of this type. It doesn't want developers to come forward and say, well, we'll do a load of private rented as affordable housing. But it's not. If we go back to the first part, which talks about needs not being met by the market, it is clear that people do get their needs met by the market. Now, I think that the additional issue, where do we need additional housing? That will be in places where people's needs cannot get met by the market. Places like Oxford, where there's significant competition in the private renter sector between students and people on very low incomes, both competing for the cheapest properties, and therefore the market does not meet people's needs, even though housing benefit technically would be available, because the supply is not there, because it's being taken up by other groups of households. That situation does not apply in Horsham, where the private renter sector, whilst not significant in comparison with some other locations, is clearly playing a significant role in meeting people's needs. So I think that the definition in Annex 2 is quite clear.
Okay, well, that's for me to determine. Mr. Macklin, do you want to comment on this?
Sorry, sir, I wasn't going to, but I think it is important that you do read the Eastleigh Inspector's report of February 15, paragraph 34. He gives his justification, which is quite clear, around the reasons why you shouldn't include PRS, and it's around security of tenure. At the lower price end of the market.
If you're referring me to it, I can read it.
Yeah.
I've seen it.
The other point, of course, is we were told the figures earlier, but the number of HMOs has gone up from 3,900 to 5,000 between 2001 and 2011. The level of over-occupation has gone up to 3,000 from 2,100 in 2001. These are significant numbers, and just go to emphasise the extent of affordable need in Horsham. And I think it's important to put it all in perspective of that, because whilst HMOs might be a short-term solution, if they're housing people who are in jobs, for example, they're certainly not a long-term solution for the provision of labour force in Horsham.
Okay. Is it on affordable housing, Dr. Smith? It is, yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Just comments really, and a question as well. I think it would seem to me not very sensible to have a strategy for the provision of essential housing, which is dependent entirely upon the building and sale of new houses. Because, as we saw during the recession, despite some denials to the contrary, if for whatever reasons developers do not deliver the target that you decide upon, then, logically, the number of affordable homes will fall, provided in any one year, will fall proportionally. So that's one point. A comment, part of the problem, and possibly for sound business reasons, so this is not a criticism, but for example, Berkeley Homes, west of Southwater, development there for just under 600 houses approved earlier this year, they've negotiated a delivery of 30% affordable housings, not 35% as per the HDPF, which we're now considering, nor 40% as per the core strategy. So I do think that's an important consideration. And I don't really believe that that kind of negotiation, even though it may well be good business reasons for it, is sufficient justification, or should justify allocating even more countryside for development. And finally, it's a question, and it's not meant maliciously, because I really would like to know this. Just what proportion of affordable housing is North of Horsham going to deliver? And that's a question for Liberties through you, sir, please. Thank you.
Well, it's in the plan, isn't it? I don't know that that's been finally determined, has it? But I assume that they'll have to meet the requirement.
That's absolutely right, sir. We see the policy. We are not objecting to the policy in the HDPF, and it will be transpired when the application is submitted. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Hanley, do you want to comment on this?
Thank you, sir. This is perhaps only necessary because I'm slightly worried that you may not even have seen our submission. But I believe Mr. Sallows is right that it's the housing split that counts. I guess members of the public may actually be quite baffled by some of the statistics and figures that have been thrown around this morning. So if I can just hit you with one or two. In 2011, apparently, according to the DCLG, there were about 55,000 households in Horsham, and that's projected to rise to about 66,900 in 2031. These are to house 145,368 people by then.
Yeah, Mr. Hanley, hang on. Look,
well, there is a point.
Okay, what's the point? I'll check that I've got your rep. It might have been disaggregated, and I've certainly seen something from you, if only, and certainly seen the summary of it. So what's your point about
the point
affordable
is
housing,
about
please?
affordable housing, sir, that this may not be a statistical the right thing to do to begin with, but if you just stick with it for a moment, if you divide the one figure into the other, you actually get a person per household ratio of 1.39, which is beginning to tell you something. If you then perhaps used a second example and said, well, that may not be the right thing to do. Let's think should there be households with a few more people in than just ones and twos. And you said, well, let's have 1,000 of those homes providing space for 4 people. Clearly, the number of homes goes down, the number of people go down, and if you divide the one figure by the other, you come to a figure of 1.15. This is telling you that the need is for small accommodation for single and couples. But if you went even further and you said, well, what would happen if you had 1,000 units with 4 residents, 1,000 with 3 residents, another 1,000 with 2 residents, and then divided the figures, you would come up with a statistical nonsense of having to have 0.84 people per household. This is telling us that what we shouldn't be doing is building chateaus for commuters, but concentrating at the lower end of the market, however that is to be achieved. And whether that is through the developers...
Well, okay, well, I've got information about that and what the needs are, and this, I mean, that's the Chilmark report, but we're talking about affordable housing need, not just overall mix.
Well, that's what I was talking about, sir, affordable housing. And it is certainly, surely, the people at the lower end of the market, the starter people, who are looking for affordable housing in the ones and twos. I don't see how that is not
well,
relevant.
It is, but it's not necessarily that, is it? There are families in needing affordable housing as well.
Well, indeed so.
I mean, that's all in, that is in this figure. I would like a note from the council, or if you can find out over lunchtime, a response to Mr. Boyle's point, or if it's just accepted, fine. About the number, the arithmetical mistake. Mr. Sallows, you've been waving vigorously your board.
Sort of coming back to the point from the Russell Parish Council's mission, was that separating out the requirement for affordable housing from the number of houses, and the issue is whether the provision of housing overall, if we take a percentage for affordable housing, will meet the affordable housing need. And the Parish Council have questioned the potential for private developers to do that, and historically they've done that very badly. And there's been no no response to our suggestion that where there is that shortfall, rather than increasing the number of housing that's allowed by private developers, you increase the number of council houses that are built where council owns land already.
Okay, you've already made that point in a way, really, and that Mr. Gardner has is, is it a policy response or is it, part of the OAN? I think I've got that point. Mr. Shutt, your board's been up for some time.
The Chilmark report has been somewhat disparaged. I think apparently some errors in their numbers, but I don't think it's disputed, or I hope it isn't, what they say about the relative performance on affordable housing in Horsham compared with the rest of this county and indeed England, which shows that its situation has deteriorated in terms of relative affordability between for the lower quartile. And that isn't, if I may say so, not necessarily reflected in your comments in your initial findings. So there is a problem. And the other point I wanted to make is that...
sorry, but then, hang on, what we're coming on to, that's coming on to the market signals point, which I was hoping to do before lunch. I mean, I'm not sure we're going to make that, but I mean, that would... Are you saying that Horsham's... Mr. Gardner's made a point about... I think Horsham started to make points about market signals that actually Horsham wasn't particularly any different to anywhere else in the southeast or in comparable.
Well, I'm sorry I haven't got the table with me, but it's in the Chilmark report. I think possibly, I don't know if anyone's got a copy to hand, but it does definitely indicate that over the last 5 or 10 years, I forget the period, housing affordability has deteriorated in Horsham compared with the wider region. And I'm taking that as read, but it may be subject to question.
Well, let's maybe deal with that very briefly in a minute. What was your second point?
Well, I just wanted to make the point, this is related, and perhaps you could say it's to do with market signals, but it relates back to a previous point where we heard our developer friends telling us that they are anxious to build more houses so that, implicitly, that they can push down the prices. Well, that just doesn't stack up against the record, and I'm afraid the NPPF has not helped matters by allowing developers to get out of their affordable housing obligations under the viability clause of the framework. And experience shows that they do this all over the country, left, right and centre, and that's why we have such an appalling housing crisis still. And finally, if I may say so, that this is not a subject for this inquiry, the only answer is going to be far greater intervention by the public sector, which has disappeared from the scene over the last 30 years.
Well, as you said, that's not a matter for this hearing at all. So, market signals, just briefly, the relative position. What's the council's position on this? The relative, I think it is that the relative position is slightly worse.
Yes.
And you've made a slight allowance for it.
Yes, and that's an allowance to effectively improve household formation rates of younger households. And again, I think sitting with, rather than picking a figure, 10% or whatever it might be, at least by doing that we can model that onto the same population growth, so we're not having this impact on other locations. And I think bearing in mind with that the CLG's household projections, as already mentioned, are already building in a far more significant improvement to formation rates compared to the previous version. So we think that's taking the evidence in the round, that's an appropriate response.
Okay. Presumably some people dispute that. Yeah, Mr. Stevens.
Thank you, sir. I did just want to make a point about the affordable housing question before we moved on to market signals. Is that all right?
Yes, all right. Your ball, wasn't it?
It was just towards the end, and then we moved on to market signals. I'm sorry about that. It is this question about the percentage rate, and Mr. Boyle did point out that even if you were delivering at 35% affordable housing, you're not going to achieve even the lower end of the council's identified ranges of what the affordable housing need is.
And so the point about that is,
well, the problem is
there a policy response that you get more of the OAN as affordable?
Exactly, I think so, and that is in keeping with the advice in the PPG, which invites plan makers to consider an overall increase in the supply in order to achieve
it doesn't
the
say
advice
that
rates of affordable
it doesn't
housing.
say that they necessarily should.
Exactly. No, I do take that
And there's
point.
a dispute there.
It's about whether the council considers it would be desirable to counter a worsening trend in affordability, as exhibited in affordability of market housing, but also the fact that people can't even access market housing, hence their need to be provided for an affordable housing product. And Horsham's local plan, does identify that affordability is a major issue in the district. So Chapter 6 of the main modifications, page 51, it says the high cost of housing can act as a barrier to suitable housing for many people who wish to live and work in the district. I think the MPPF places a lot of emphasis upon affordability. It's a core planning principle. It's one of the core planning principles in paragraph 17. It says plans should take account of market signals such as land prices and housing affordability. What I put to you, sir, this morning was that I don't think that an increase of just 21 dwellings above the baseline demographic projection, that's the baseline demographic projection of 597, plus a 3% transactional vacancies allowance, represents a sufficient adjustment to take into account market signals or to provide some allowance to improve the delivery of affordable housing products. some of the other participants said, well, you know, perhaps the way around it is to increase the percentage of affordable housing. It is an option for the council if it then considers rowing back on other things that it might want to get from planning gain. It is an option, but generally, if you do that, if you increase the affordable housing percentage, then you start to perhaps encroach upon problems of viability in non-delivery of sites, which would only exacerbate the problem of delivery.
Yeah, well, that's going back on something we've already considered.
Market signals. I'll get on to that. So market signals, I think, I've mentioned to you before, I think the evidence is there to suggest that a greater increase, perhaps a 10% allowance, which has been used in Uttlesford and Eastleigh, is warranted. Simon Emerson, who did the Eastleigh plan, actually in the Cornwall local plan examination, has gone against that. He doesn't think a 10% allowance is warranted. Canterbury, interestingly, Canterbury Council, whose plan's about to go to examination next week, is actually countenancing a 20% uplift to account for market signals, and their ratio to lower quartile house prices to lower quartile earnings isn't as great as that exhibited in here in Horsham. The evidence is in the SHMA. I think we need to be considering at least 10%, and that's what I put in my representations and the main modifications. Thank you.
Okay. Any increase on 10%?
It was really just I mean, I think there's recognition there's a market signals issue. I think it's important to, there's market signals issues everywhere, particularly in the southeast. So just to compare it in the south against the southeast is
and that's what.
But that is exactly why the guidance in the MPPF seeks to boost significantly the supply of housing. So it's not just following trends; it's boosting significantly. So that requires an upward adjustment. Now, it is also important to look at absolute. I'm just conscious of your interim report, so where you, in paragraph 12, you talk about the rate of increase in house price, but it's and that implies to me.
Well, that's one factor. I mean, there's also relative factors, and another factor that I know the inspector at Crawley didn't accept that there should be an increase for market signals in Crawley.
Yeah. But Crawley's house prices aren't as great as
they might be different. Yeah, but it's,
I
mean, it's all relative. So what's the guidance intending to say? Is it to say if you've got a particular area with particular problems? I mean, my point about Horsham initially was, and that's my initial findings. There might be more evidence now put to me today, but it's not necessarily that much different to other places nearby.
It might not be, but
and therefore,
that is exactly
is there a special case for saying there should be a market signals upward adjustment?
That's exactly why we've got these significant numbers of people in houses of multiple occupation and over occupation. That's exactly why we've got such a high affordability ratio. I mean, it's comparable with Uttlesford, and the Uttlesford inspector again considered it was, again, that was another one that sort of warranted a 10% uplift. I think it is significant here. I think the other point I just wanted to turn to was in recognition of the issue, G. O'Hearn have sought an upward adjustment. And this, I don't want to go over old ground in terms of this formation rate adjustment that we were talking about earlier, but we know that has resulted in a 22 dwellings per annum uplift. So I believe that the Brighton OAN was submitted to the examination over the past couple of days. Brighton have gone out to consultation this week on their OAN. G. O'Hearn have produced that report. That number has the OAN for Brighton has significantly gone up, and we can talk about that in respect of unmet need later. But as part of that exercise, G. O'Hearn made a market signals adjustment adopting the same principles of falling back to 2001 formation rates. But in that respect, and possibly because of the structure of the population profile there, that resulted in an uplift of 14%. Now here we're looking at 4% adjustment. Now are the market dynamics in terms of the affordability ratio so different in Brighton that would justify that much of a difference?
Well, I'm not dealing with Brighton or Crawley or with Sussex or whatever. I mean, that's... but they could well be, couldn't they? Okay, I'll take that as a point. I think we need to break soon. How many more points? How many more people want to make comments on market signals? 1, 2, 3. Oh, lots. We break. Sorry, we need to have a break somewhere. It's gone lunchtime. I'm just going to carry on doing with as much of this as I can today, even if I can't get all of it done. How do people feel about a shortish lunch break? Half an hour. Okay. I'll resume at 10 to 2, everybody.